In this segment of the class, we've been talking about culture and identity. And today, to talk about Asian identity, I have with me Professor Bo Kong, a political scientist who's an expert in energy policy in China. He's also from China. What part of China are you from?
Western China.
From Western China. So tell us a little bit about culture in China. I know culture is very important in Chinese society. How can you describe Chinese culture to us?
Well, you're very right about the importance of culture in shaping the Chinese identity. At the individual level and the collective level, culture plays a very important role. To be specific, we are talking about a set of norms and principles and codes that emanate from the combination of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism that really shape the Chinese identity. And these values manifest themselves in the emphasis on loyalty, filial piety, and righteousness through self-enhancement and learning, for example. Of course, these values go through constant restructuring as time goes on. When the CCP took over under Mao, China launched this cultural revolution that of course, influenced how these values are felt in China and how they manifest themselves. But in general, what it means to be Chinese is to be good, for example, to be conscious of hierarchy, to be respectful of authority, and to be a good member of the family, and to be a good member of the community. And that's very, very true. And you can take these values to a larger level and to the collective level. And one important part of this is faith. That is respect and status. Chinese are very, very sensitive and very, very conscious of faith. And so the idea is do not lose faith in front of the public, or do not lose faith in front of friends, and do not lose faith in front of your family. And the same is true, for the country as well. That's why when the Chinese president comes to America, and he's very sensitive to the type of treatment he receives from the White House, whether the 21 cannons are fired, whether he receives the state dinner, whether he receives whether it is a state visit or work visit. These all matter because in the view of Chinese, these are the rituals and ceremonies that carry a lot of symbolism.
So you're from China, but you live in the United States. So you can maybe compare a little bit for us the differences between an Eastern identity and Chinese identity and Chinese culture and Western identity, the culture that we might have in the United States, for example. So what are some of the differences and what are some of the similarities? And would you say that we're more similar than different?
Well, I think there are differences and similarities. And then the differences primarily lie in the fact that the American values focus more on individualism, whereas the Chinese values focus on collectivism. This, of course, is also true of the influence that was imposed by the Chinese Communist Party over the past couple decades, and therefore, there is this huge emphasis on not challenging the authority, not challenging the hierarchy, whether it is in the family, whether it is in the classroom, whether it is at work. When you go to the Chinese classrooms, you don't see students fighting, quarreling about, or debating or arguing over one story. Instead, what you see is the professor basically standing there trying to portray one story. This is pretty much representative of how the Chinese society works. There is only one voice, that's the Chinese Communist Party. And so the idea is do not challenge the authority. That's very much true. And the other difference is that the Chinese culture tends to focus on, or the Chinese thinking tends to be very, very networked or interlinked, whereas the American thinking tends to be very, very linear and logical. And this sometimes is not quite obvious to people. When Chinese come to the negotiation table or engage Americans about foreign affairs, they tend to go back to dynasties when some of the historical events still carry some symbolic meaning for the today's engagement with America. But for Americans, this is very, very difficult to understand because Americans tend to get down to business very quickly, whereas the Chinese pay so much attention to the rituals, the symbolism. And the other important difference is that Chinese tend to focus on the big picture first, and then they get down to business. For example, when it comes to WTO negotiations with the United States, the Chinese try to set the tone correct first. And the idea is if we can agree to the big picture, everything else will follow. Whereas for America, that comes from the litigious, the legal culture. The emphasis is focused on details. If you can't agree on details, how can you agree to the big picture? So oftentimes there are a lot of back and forth between China on these differences. And I think there are also similarities. Both cultures emphasize hard work, diligence, being part of family, and I think these values manifest in both societies.
Well, I have to ask because I've spent some time in China myself, and clearly there are a lot of Western products and institutions, and I mean, you can go to Starbucks and McDonald's and Pizza Hut and 7-Eleven even, all throughout China. Right. So how has that had an impact on Chinese culture and identity? Do you think perhaps with globalization we've seen a shift in culture in China, or are these cultural tendencies that you're talking about really running deep in society and are really likely to sustain themselves?
I think that's a very good point. Globalization certainly has raised a lot of challenges for Chinese regarding the issue of what it means to be Chinese. For example, when you ask me what does it mean for you to be Chinese, I may find this question very, very difficult to answer because inherently I don't know what it means to be Chinese. Some of the values I cherish, I grew up with, are not necessarily, practiced or not necessarily cherished by the younger generation in China that grew up with American movies, grew up eating, American fast food, etc. So there is a huge generation gap when it comes to Chinese identity. The identity I have may not be the identity shared by my peers in China, particularly younger people. Whenever I go back to China, I find myself just amazed at the differences we have, not the similarities we have. Sometimes I ask myself, is China still my country? The country I used to know, is China the same China I used to know? I think the answer is pretty much not. But having said that, I think there are some deep cultural codes, cultural creeds that are still there. For example. This emphasis on family values, this emphasis on community values, and is still there. But it just goes through this constant restructuring. It's being challenged by the globalization. For example, in the Chinese culture doesn't emphasize universalism, whereas the Western culture does. When it comes to human rights, that is considered to be a universal value. But the Chinese view is very, very pragmatic, very, very practical, and the official view is. The universal, human rights comes after the material rights being ensured and guaranteed. And to some extent, that goes back to the law of hierarchical needs. And you can't argue with that because there is some truth behind it. But nevertheless, the Chinese won't go around and say, we have a universal value that ought to be embraced and practiced by everyone. That's why I think there is this deep tradition in China throughout the dynasties that China never exports ideas. And because the idea is, being the center of that part of the world, China had a lot of good cultures, a lot of good values that others sought to embrace. So whenever they wanted the values, they would come to China and seek those values.
Well, students, what do you think? Now that you've learned a little bit about Chinese society, Chinese culture, Chinese identity, do you think you could see the global community from a Chinese perspective? How might you view American foreign policy, for example, from a Chinese perspective? Let us know what you think.